on expectations between now and 2020. You see the gentleman in our panel. We have one replacement this morning. Dr. Mohammed noted that he had an extended personal tragedy in the family, so His Excellency Rachid has kindly stepped in this morning. I think, Minister Rachid, I'd like to start with you, if we can, and look at the euphoria, 1 month, 2 month euphoria that's come back into financial markets. Now, as you know, financial markets usually serve as a 6 to 9 month lead indicator of expectations for earnings and expectations for consumer confidence. We have an incredibly unusual situation right now where you see industrial output collapsing in Europe, down 20% on a year-on-year basis, which is highly unusual. We have stability starting to find its way here in the region, but markets are projecting, growth next year in the region, perhaps 4 to 5%. Is there a reality gap before we get into the reform discussion of where we are today? Can we sustain this sort of optimism that has reappeared in the last 60 days?
Well, good morning, everybody. I think the biggest challenge still, when we look at the global economic crisis, is still focused on the financial institutions, especially in the US. And that is still relatively a black box, which the transparency issue related to it is, I think, guiding a lot of the forecast and a lot of the expectation for the growth numbers in the world. There are no doubt improvement happening in understanding better the banking situation in the United States and the financial institution position and the reaction of all this institution to the rescue packages that have been put forward. So that we need to keep that always in mind, because I think that really sits at the heart of our capability to predict what is going to happen in the global economy, and especially, of course, the impact on us, on the region here. But when we look at all the other numbers, the indicators are very clear. Industrial output have been sliding at a very high rate. We have seen in the last quarter one of the deepest shrink in output industrial. The consumption of oil is dropping in all developing as well as developed economies. But we have started to see in certain markets signs that there is a pickup from this very low base that is happening. When you are referring all this to the stock market and the performance that we have seen in the last few weeks, of course, it shows that this is still quite a volatile situation, and we are still going to see some significant movements up and down in relation to the expectation that is taking place at the moment. Is this a true recovery in developing countries? Is it a true recovery in some of the emerging markets? Well, still big question marks. The heart of the question sits still on the financial institution at this stage. But I can tell you it looks much better in the region here. But I assume we'll come back to the rescue packages and what we are doing there. Okay.
Yes. Thanks very much. If I can call on His Excellency Bassem Al-Salam in our host country here, very similar to the situation that we see in Egypt, which had 4.3% growth in the latest quarter. Jordan, I had a chance to talk to and interview Dr. Umayya of the central bank last night, Toucan. Growth of 3 to 3.5% in 2009. That's not a crisis. It's not 5.6% like last year. Does it require, and part of that result is due to the fact of conservative banking regulations that were put into this market going back 5, 6 years ago. Does that sort of growth require a new rescue package for Jordan? Does it require different fundamentals, a different approach to what's taking place?
Thank you very much. I think I have to be extremely careful looking at Mr. Toucan right in front of me. I have to be careful in what I say and how I say it. I think we're very fortunate to have a good, solid banking sector that really has not been affected drastically, in the sense that there's still a lot of liquidity, and we can really claim that not a single bank really faced any problem. Having said that, I think the problem with what's happening with the banking sector, that the flow of cash to the economy is not moving as fast as one would like, although the central bank did a lot of measures with interest rate and other tools. And they worked on creating more of a confidence in guaranteeing the deposits of all depositors. Having said that, I think we started to feel that there is a slowdown in the economy in terms of revenues, sales tax, what have you, which is a sign that things are slowing down. And our expected growth rate of 6%, now we are revisiting it to be in the range of between 3 and 4%. Now, we don't have the luxury to talk about any stimulus package. We're already running a budget with a high deficit in the range of, we said the revenues will be lower and we accept a higher deficit. This is our stimulus package. So we're going to run at 7.3% deficit. And this is basically all what we can do. We don't have the fiscal space to even spend more money. So this is basically where we stand. Our economy is solid, and the reforms that we've had over the last 10 years really will allow us and help us in taking the shock of this year and live with a high deficit. Having said that, our exit strategy for lowering the deficit in the future will be done in parallel with accepting the figure this year. The only thing that, or the main thing that we are now concentrating on, what's after the crisis, what we have to do after the crisis, and this is where we're concentrating very much on the reform process. And we're talking about new tax laws, we're talking about a new custom tariff structure and investments to make life easy and to make Jordan a more competitive place to invest in. Previously, we were enjoying a very high FDIs. The last quarter of 2008, we suffered, and FDIs went down by 70% to what they were in 2007, compared year to year. And we're seeing the same slowdown first quarter of this year. So basically, this is what we're working on, and again, a very important point that we're trying to make sure that the people that are not earning much are not suffering. And with lowering price of oil, lowering commodity prices, they are living in a better standard position to what they used to be in 2008.
In fact, in my opening comments, we talked about 14% inflation. It's come down in Jordan to below 4% in the last year. Sheikh Ahmed, if I can have you bring your microphone closer to you and address a question on the follow-up from His Excellency the Minister about what the banks are doing today. Now, I know Bahrain cut interest rates, provided liquidity to the market, moved quite quickly during the heat of the crisis in the autumn of 2008. But are the banks lending in Bahrain, and does it require a different way of injecting capital into the system to provide lending in the region, but specifically for Bahrain? The banks are in a more comfortable position today, but are they giving this money to consumers, and does it require a different set of reforms or rescue packages going forward in your country?
If I'm talking about banks, I think banks will lend when they see the opportunity to lend. They're in the business of making money. So in defense of banks, they will lend when they see that there is an opportunity very clearly out there for them to make a profit, basically. We operate a banking system where we have conventional and Islamic banks, and both have felt the challenges from the crisis. But when we look at the crisis and how it hit us, we're different from the United States. We're different from Europe. We've got to see how the crisis has affected us in our part of the world. And to us, when we look at the average citizen, man and woman on the street working, today they feel less inflation, they feel they're better off if they're guaranteed their job. And in our economy, for the most part, they know that their jobs are secure. So on the one hand, this has not been all bad for the average citizen. They felt much better off. When we look at financial institutions, lending for corporations and so on, of course, during the period of probably September and October, we all felt the credit crunch all the way until December. I think things now overall are easing. We're seeing better opportunities. We're seeing a sense of euphoria, maybe a bit too premature in my mind for the level of information that His Excellency Mr. Rachid mentioned. We're all seeing that there are negative numbers. But banks, when they see the opportunity to lend, they will lend. I think the role of the state, the role of the government is to make sure that the right policies are in place for them, for the short, medium, and longer term. And that's where we are focused right now. The challenge to us is not to just address the immediate challenges that we see coming out of this crisis in terms of shortness of liquidity and so on. I think the central bank addresses that by introducing different policies, monitors the market, and we've gone through the initial phase of the credit crunch. I think we're beyond that now. I think where there are good opportunities, banks definitely will lend, but they're also looking at asset valuations, and they are aware that there are fluctuations in market prices, and they want to protect themselves. Capital adequacy, for example, in Bahrain is 19%. That is very comforting going forward. So the challenge, I think, for many of us sitting around here, especially on the government side, is looking at what is the challenge going forward in terms of job creation, what is the challenge going forward in terms of economic growth. Are our economic models that have worked for us in the past few years sustainable going forward? That is where I see the majority of the challenge right now.
Okay, thanks very much. Arif Naqvi, the issue of asset prices was brought up by the minister. You're a private equity firm looking at valuations today, where to deploy some assets that you still have after your fundraising round in the autumn. Asset price valuations in the region, and this playing into the rescue package for the region itself.
John, I think the first thing that comes to my mind, and whenever I talk to ministers across the Arab world, every single one says, our economy is solid, our banks are working fine. Well, if that's the case, why are we even discussing a rescue issue? And why are we talking about fundamental reform, as we've been doing yesterday and today? I think that what we are facing in this region today, and I'll come on to asset prices in a second, but we're actually in the Middle East, not in the middle or in the eye of the storm. We're quite far away from it. It started elsewhere, and the region per se is not as badly hit as everywhere else. And yet we're sitting here, we're discussing theoretical rescue packages, we're discussing what needs to be done. I think the real issue that this region is beset with right now is consumer confidence. And consumer confidence is something that can't just come back through just governmental action. It's got to be what I think the US administration is doing at present, which is talking people back into feeling good. And that's a very, very important thing that governments across this region need to be doing. And asset prices, the economy, everything else recovers on the back of that. I know this is not technical enough an answer as you were seeking, but I think we have to work on those issues, the soft issues first, because the fundamentals in our economies are generally quite solid.
Good. How about the asset price valuations that you see today? Do we have more to work out? Are we getting ahead of ourselves and thinking that the worst is over?
You're asking me? I think asset price valuations have come down from last year's highs without question, and I think there's been a readjustment of thinking, there's been a realignment within the private sector certainly, that what we saw as extremely good times are not necessarily here anymore, so expectations have been lowered. That goes without saying. I think that's there already, and I think in the foreseeable future we will continue to experience lower valuations than what we saw before. But are the bad times over? I don't know. I mean, globally, I don't think that we can make a call at this stage and say that the bad times are over. Maybe we're just in the middle of a short-term euphoric burst again caused on the back of feeling good, talking ourselves back into feeling good. And the fundamentals in the real economy are much worse, and we'll see much worse things happening towards the third quarter and fourth quarter of this year. If that happens, we're not immune, but we won't be as badly hit. But this region will be affected as well. I don't think there's any doubt in my mind on that.
Okay. Joe Saddi, there's always this danger that a downturn gives a fantastic giant excuse not to move forward with reforms. This has been a reform-driven region for the last 5 years, in part by calls by the business community saying we need this sort of climate to move forward. But do we use the downturn to have a much greater role of the state and therefore back off on reforms that are more business-friendly, more conducive to trade, more conducive to cross-border transactions?
I mean, that's a very interesting question, John, and there's a big debate around this particular topic around the world, in fact. I mean, rightfully so, a lot of attention has been put in recent months on having the right fiscal, monetary policies in place, the right spending packages, and as was said, I mean, liquidity, or rather the flow of liquidity, remains a big issue. Just by way of an anecdote, I was struck last month, and that's a short-term worry, and I'll move to the long-term worry that I have. I was struck by a conversation I had last month with a private sector developer of power plants in the Gulf. And that gentleman had a power plant contract award in hand, had an offtake contract in place, sovereign guarantees in place, and no bank was willing to come forth and lend the money. Now, if that is the benchmark for lending, you know, what else is going to happen? So getting the flow of liquidity going for the next 2-3 years is absolutely essential. Having said that, the bigger worry that I have is that we get distracted away from the long-term socioeconomic reform that is much, much needed. And if you think about the various facets of it, this is about economic diversification. We need to continue pushing diversification of our economies. This is about liberalization. Yes, I mean, we still need to liberalize further our economies while building, and that's the lesson learned, I think, from the current crisis, while building our regulatory and supervision capabilities. It's about modernizing government institution, government services. It's around having the right labor laws in place, you know, labor mobility, labor flexibility. It's around thinking hard about what is the right social safety net that we offer our citizens. And last but not least, and I think this is probably the toughest challenge that we have from long-term perspective, is maintain the course on educational reform. I believe that, frankly, and unless we reduce the mismatch between the skills that our schools and universities are producing and what the future labor market will require in terms of skill set, we will not grow our economies in a sustainable way, we will not diversify, and our societies will not grow more stable. So that is the big worry I have. It's being distracted from all of this.
Good. Let me turn that to Khalid then, Janahi. The critical thinking that's necessary today to plan for the next 5 to 10 days for the region, there has always been a tendency, partially because of the Gulf currencies and most of the currencies in the regions being linked to the dollar, that whatever policies the U.S. put forth or whatever the Bank of England does gets duplicated in the region. Can we break from that mentality and say the reform packages or the rescue packages necessary here is not what's needed from Washington or what's not needed from London?
Well, for the next 10 days, it's easy, because I think you said 5 to 10 days. So
no, 10 years.
That shouldn't be difficult. I think just coming to the single currency issue, I mean, I have this view being from the private sector. When you say single currency, you're pegged to the dollar, then with all due respect, your monetary policy is set by the guy who sets the dollar monetary policy rather than you setting your own dollar policy, because if you don't, you have to carry on. I mean, if they lower the rates, you have to lower the rates, because if you don't, then you're allowing arbitrage, and we are being, especially in the Gulf, we are very professional, we don't want arbitrage of the currencies, so we don't do that. So the policy is set somewhere else and you follow it. I am personally against it on a long-term basis, because I don't think that adds to sustainability. Maybe, as Arif was saying earlier on in the room, it might give you a bit of a room of coverage at the beginning, protection. But on a long-term basis, I'm personally against it. I don't think it's a good idea. So the policies happening there affects you from the monetary side. But the point that Joe's making from the educational side, I think that's very, very critical. We should not allow governments or institutions or the elites to take us away from what we started on the education reform side. We have not, actually, education reform in our part of the world is a question of turning you from basically reading too much and learning how, and getting more into mathematical and getting more into science. I think that's the beginning. I think the main point is allowing people to have what you just said, critical thinking. Critical thinking is what is going to take us up. Critical thinking is going to take these countries in the Middle East into the next stage. Unfortunately, governments and elites, they don't like that, because once you start having critical thinking, then immediately there's a question mark of you questioning issues that the governments and elites do, and that's not liked by the elites and governments. And the elites and the governments, whether we like it or not, in the Middle East and most of the world, they run the show. What I'm worried about from the rescue package that we're talking about, what's rescue package for who? Is it for the people who lost the tens and billions of dollars in the past 8 months? Is it the rescue package for the countries as a whole? I hope that the governments, they do not take this, what's been happening in the past 10 months, as an opportunity to interfere more into the business. Because governments in the Middle East, by and large, they've basically been having 70 to 80% of the economy. And there has been a bit of liberalization, a bit of capitalism, real capitalism, coming into our region for the past 10 to 15 years. And if we really backlog and we start the governments coming in again, that is the biggest damage that we're going to have. What's been going around us, as Arif said, we're not immune from that. And I think Rachid said it. The toxic assets that's in the United States are there. Only around 1.5 trillion has been accounted for. There are numbers which are there, run between 6 to 8 to 10 trillion dollars of toxic assets. Now, we don't know what's the right number. My 14-year-old son says anyone can be a good economist today because he can say whatever he says, and tomorrow if he's proved wrong, well, even the best economists have been proved wrong. So what's happening is that this toxic asset is creating a major problem. I agree. I think Joe mentioned a very important point about the power plant thing. Sheikh Ahmed mentioned about Islamic banks and non-Islamic banks. Most of the infrastructural business that we see in the Gulf, I'm talking Gulf specific now, which has been basically sponsored in terms of investment from the equity side and from the financing side, has been coming from what I would call Islamic and investment banks. They are both the same as far as I'm concerned, because Islamic banks are investment banks by nature. Now, what's going to happen, the reality problem here, and as any good banker, when you look at it, you got to be very careful how you, yes, Sheikh Ahmed is right, you got to look at opportunities. But unfortunately, it's not just opportunities, you got to protect your balance sheet, because you don't have a lender of last resort as an Islamic bank or as investment bank. A lot of the investments which have gone into infrastructure, they've been supported by raising sukuk or raising bonds from outside. So the flow, let me simplify, the flow of the money from the Gulf, reserves and non-reserves has been going out to the big banks outside, and we've been basically getting it back through sukuks and bonds from the bigger banks into our region and financing a lot of the infrastructure. Now the big banks, as we know, all of them are in a limbo today. Nobody's going to lend bank out. So everybody's basically looking after themselves outside. So until such time you have fixing in the outside world, in the bigger world, you cannot bring money back in. And that's an important thing. So when banks look at their maturities of their financing in big transactions in the next few months to the next 18 months, they have to be basically very careful that they have sufficient liquidity to cover that, God forbid, if there is a call, say within 6 months or 9 months, which they cannot renew. Because in the past, we've been used to it, that we could renew the financing coming from outside. Now, you're going to have a problem. You're certainly going to have a problem one place or the other, where there's going to be calls on maturities that you have to pay that out. So banks, and this is the fairness to banks. I don't think it's only a regulatory issue which is coming. Actually, I'm very happy to see the first quarter results for most of the banks in the Gulf, where there is actually balance sheet protection. My personal worry was that people would just go for profitability rather than being basically looking at balance sheet protection. And there is good thing to see. Most of the liquidity, look at the balance sheets today, between 25 to 35% of the assets is basically cash. Now, in normal business as a bank, that's too high. However, in today's world, I think you got to protect yourself, and that's a good thing. So that gives me a bit of, what I would say, confidence that our bankers are doing the right thing. The regulators should back off from the bankers. Sheikh Ahmed, and I think it was Minister of Finance of Jordan, mentioned about talking about opportunities. But opportunities, you got to be extremely careful. You got to have what I would call Open economy. There are a lot of banks today, they see an opportunity, but they are not allowed to take that opportunity because regulators are worried. Because if they take those opportunities, then there is a liquidity crunch in the countries. Arif is a very sensitive person. He talks about, and I agree with him totally, that everybody says we are in a wonderful world, we don't have problems. However, we are here talking about rescue. No, we do have problems because everybody's facing this liquidity crunch. I'm sitting on cash, Arif is sitting on cash. I tell you, if we have good opportunities, we'll go for it. However, we'll think twice before we do that. Last year, we maybe would have thought, yes, we do our risk management, we do our due diligence, and would have gone for it. Now, it's not just doing due diligence and risk management. You do twice as much, and to tick the box to say go ahead is much, much harder now because you got to protect yourself for the future.
Good.
Khalid, you're actually a capitalist. Wow.
I'm a Republican capitalist. There you go.
Well, actually, it was a very spirited defense of the banking sector, but I have to say, I mean, as Sheikh Ahmed started off saying, banks are there to make money. I think the real issue is what Joe said, a perfectly positioned project in a critical sector in the region with all of the guarantees and so on in place, no money. So I don't think, Khalid, you can just blame the central bankers and say the regulators are worried and therefore there's a squeeze. I think the real problem is the banking community itself. I think that the banks in the region are being extremely conservative. And the central banks and the governments have done the right things. They have pumped in and shored up the balance sheets of banks. They have pumped cash in. But the bankers are actually keeping it all inside. They're keeping it to themselves. And the intermediaries in a classical economy are actually not doing their job. They're keeping the cash. They're reducing their ratios from 30 to 1 to 15 to 1. And I am sorry, that doesn't make the regional economy work. In my head, at least, I'd like to see more of that. And if that is not working, then we need to work off the classical solutions that are available, of monetary policy that is available to central bankers. And we need to start thinking about disintermediating banks. Because in a region like this, we need to make sure that the investor and the end consumer, the real economy, are being catered for, not just the banks. The banks potentially for a year or so need to be disintermediated. And I'm all in favor of less government. And I'm not in favor of more government, but I do believe government has a very central role to play at this time.
Sheikh Ahmed first, and I'll come back to Minister Rachid.
Yeah, I think when we talk about rescue, I think what needs rescuing is our plans for education, our plans for job creation, our plans for economic growth, and to continue the reform program definitely in every country, even though we're facing these challenges. I think that is the most critical, important point that requires rescuing. I think when we look at where we are, this crisis has been reinventing itself every few weeks. But I think we're now settling into a phase where we're beginning to see credit flowing. I'm not saying everything is fine. We certainly have challenges, and when I see it on a macro level, there are many things that need fixing, including issues like looking at new regulations, looking at how the world will address the challenges that we have overall. We very much welcome, for example, the G20 as a move from G7 and the work that that has done. We also believe it's very important for all of us as different countries under different international forums, whether it's the IMF, World Bank, all the others, to be able to participate in what the new world financial structure will look like. I think that is critical, that is important. But I think when I look at financial institutions and what needs to be done, there is certain room for the state making sure there is enough liquidity within the system overall. But when I said that banks make the right choice for investment, it is making the right choice looking into consideration what their balance sheet position is, what are the challenges that faces them, and what is the overall liquidity position for that country or that region. I see that easing over the next few months, and I see better opportunity. Yes, there are some challenges for bigger projects to get finance. We will face institutions that will have mismatches and other challenges. That is inevitable. But I think overall, when we look at how growth needs to be maintained, we see, first of all, positive numbers for growth for the region, which is very important. We're not looking at negative growth. So I'm trying to paint a positive picture because that's what I see. There are definitely a lot of problems, much more than we're used to, much more than what we'd like. But it's not all negative and not all challenging. I think what we saw in the world coming together on the G20 to try and sort out these issues, and the work that I know is happening in the IMF and World Bank, I am more optimistic about the medium long-term view. But the challenges that we see right now around us require sometimes certain treatment for different areas, but it's not all negative.
Okay, can I follow up quickly with you, and then I'd go to Minister Rachid. Abdulla-Janahi said something that's quite provocative. Are the leaders here ready for the challenge? This is probably the most substantial downturn in the world in 60 years. The challenge to monarchies in the region, are they responding to the challenge that's been put forth? Or are you shaking your head and, oh my God, this is something that we weren't prepared for and we're not ready to fulfill the aspirations of the next generation? Are the leaders within the region that have been in place for 50, 60 years up for the challenges that are there now?
I think when we look at this crisis and we see how we got into this, let me give you numbers from Bahrain because I know them, but they're similar in most GCC countries. Our debt to GDP is 18%. Our loans to deposits is 65%. When we look at numbers like that, average capital adequacy, I mentioned that earlier, 19%. We are conservative by nature in our approach because we believe we've got to provide long-term sustainable growth. We're not looking at this as a company. I don't need to deliver a profit over the next 2 or 3 years. My goal is to make sure I maintain average growth of 6 to 8% over the long term. And to achieve that, it's a matter of introducing the right policies and make sure the right mechanisms are in place that the economy will generate that growth. When we are facing such challenges that we are facing today, we understand from what happened in previous times that the next challenge for us is to make sure that there are enough jobs coming in. We fought a long and hard battle to reduce unemployment to 3.7%. We're not going to just watch it creep up again because the market or the economy is not creating enough jobs. The challenge for us now is what new sectors we're already beginning to do that. And no one knows what the world economy is going to look like 5, 10 years from today. So simply put, what we're doing is we're talking to consultants, what are the possible 4 scenarios that the world will move into? And then what is the current mix in terms of diversification of our own economy? And how do we map out a strategy from where we are today and to try and matching up with those 4 possible scenarios for the growth within the world economy? I think these are the ideas that I see coming out within the GCC and other countries. We are not sitting still. We're looking at dealing with the problems that we have today, but we're also looking over the medium term and longer term, what are the challenges that we need to address then and to make sure that the things that we have fixed can actually continue to be fixed and not come back and hit us again as problems in the future.
Thank you for that. Minister Rachid, one of the issues we talked about before coming out this morning is the push for diversification. Now, there's a 2-pronged approach, and you and I have had personal discussions about this. One is diversification into various sectors. The other is the reduced dependency on the US or the European market. You're trying to do both in Egypt, and you have a large market of 80 million consumers. Do you have to accelerate that now as a result of what we've seen?
Sure. Well, I'd like just, before I answer your question, just reflect on the discussion in the last half an hour. I'd like just to remind ourselves that this is not about rescue package. The real issue, the real big picture, the real big story in this region for the last few years, and it will continue to be the challenge for the next 25 years, is reform, change, and managing the transition. That's exactly the very serious impact of this crash test of this economic reform on the region. Because what we have been doing in the last few years in many countries, and I'm talking, of course, more specifically about Egypt, is seriously driving a reform program and making it very clear that unless we are successful in such a reform program, we will not be able to meet the challenges of the global world. Well, the crisis is one of the most serious challenges that anybody could have met. And the reality, of course, that we have seen in Egypt is that if we would not have done the reform in the last 5 years, especially in the banking system, we would have been in a very terrible situation today. That is not the case with our banking system, for instance. Because yes, we have reinforced our regulators. We have been able really to learn all the lessons from the previous crisis, which was milder, the Asian crisis that have passed and had some effect on our region here. But in the meantime, we have also created a certain momentum in our economy, well, Egypt, of course, but we have seen it in other places, where we have been able to prove to ourselves that by letting go the government, giving more space to the private sector, allowing business really to take more and more a role in most of the sectors of the economy, we created confidence, we created momentum. And then we have been hit by this global crisis, and that was a crash test. Have this been moving in the right direction, not in the right direction? Are we moving too fast, too slow? And that is actually what we are, at the moment, I think, all of us dealing with. We are clear in Egypt. We would like to continue even more reform because we feel that the test that we have met with this global crisis indicate to us that reform was in the right direction, and we would like to continue even more that. We have seen already that the momentum that have been created have taken us to a growth, as you just mentioned, 4.3% in this first quarter this year, driven by 17% growth in construction. I mean, this is one of the unique markets in the world where you have such a boom in construction. Why? Because there is confidence and there is less bureaucracy and more encouragement for people to operate there. We have in our region, because we are still very early on the curve, we have a huge potential in our internal markets, whether individually or collectively. And to be able to tap on this really significant resource from an economic development point of view, we need to make a lot of changes. And I could see many people today, even in Egypt, becoming hesitant. Should we go on? We shouldn't go on. What is the role of the government? Should we open up to even to our neighbors? Should we accelerate the regional now cooperation, or should we slow down our regional cooperation? These are very critical questions that unless we are convinced that reform is the way out, we might see a very serious setback. And I think that's part really of the feeling why there is all this contradicting discussion happening. Government saying we are fine, business saying, but if we are fine, why are we discussing this? Well, we heard that happening. And obviously, if we are really reform-minded and we'd like to continue, we should not miss that fantastic opportunity of a crisis to continue to push for a reform. We should push for a reform even in the middle of this crisis. And I think this is very clear in Egypt. That statement have been more than said across all levels in the government of Egypt. And I hope that we can really be given the space to continue that reform across the region at the same pace that we had before. Part of it is the diversification. Part of it is ensuring, and we have been lucky in Egypt that our economy is quite diversified. We have a relatively big agriculture sector, industrial sector, tourism is big, services in general is big, banking, oil and gas. But the reality, of course, is that the more we can diversify, not only in the make of our economy, but also on our customers, on our markets, on our sources, the better off we will be. And that's exactly what we have been doing. And that is also the advantage of having more and more regional cooperation. It will reduce the risk of each individual economy and each individual country on its own, because then we can benefit from that collective diversification of the region here.
I want to follow up and open it up to the panel here. Another thing that slid completely off the radar is this discussion of GAFTA, the Greater Arab Free Trade Association or Agreement, to open up this market well beyond the 6 GCC countries and a single currency, to lower barriers, to have a lot more cross-border investment. Do you want to jump in? Nobody talks about it anymore. We all talk about the WTO agreement. Minister?
Yeah, I want to just follow up on what the Dr. Rachid was saying about the building up trust of governments. I think governments have done quite a bit in terms of building and pumping in the confidence in the economies now to increase or improve the investment part from the private sector side. Now we managed to get the liquidity in banks, and now banks are not flowing the cash to the investors. And I think now banks have started to realize, at least the first quarter, that their profits won't be as good as they were last year, and they will start to change their mood of lending and pumping the liquidity. So I think we will start to see that things might improve. Arif, I didn't say that things are good. I said things were very good. And I think partly because of the reform process that we have been doing, Egypt has been doing, and other countries have been doing. And I think we should remain to do that. And this should not stop us from the reform process. In fact, I think we've talked a lot about the crisis and the rescue packages. We should start talking about after the crisis. What should we be doing after the crisis? So we should prepare ourselves now to get the reform process going on, because really we benefited in the past of how things were and how things improved, and I think we should carry on with that.
One of the things we saw over the last 4 or 5 years as a result of very high oil prices was capital from the Gulf going into the Maghreb or Levant countries, and a lot more inter-Arab investment. Nobody wants to tackle inter-Arab trade and actually taking the next big step and lowering barriers to investment. Minister Rachid, Khalid, Saddi.
Well, let me remind you that actually the Arab Free Trade Agreement is in place. We have at the moment 14 countries who do respect actually the fact that we have in goods a free trade agreement. We need to take that to a higher level, and the summit, the Arab League summit in Kuwait, which was dedicated for economic issues and was in one way or another hijacked by the issues in Gaza at the time, took a very, very important decision. And the decision was that before 2015, we should have a custom union across all our Arab countries. And it put a deadline there for the custom union, and many countries, including Egypt, have been moving since to implement now custom unions across the region. And I believe that's a very, very important critical step. The other decision that was taken also in Kuwait, and again, it should have a tremendous impact on the region, is the start of negotiation to liberate, to negotiate the free trade in services. And this is something we need really to push even faster and faster in our region. We need to see that services, people, activities could move freely from one economy to the other. At the moment, we have focused on capital, we have focused on goods, we need to move into services and people. And again, that was a decision taken. But obviously we know that these are only political decisions at a higher level. It needs to be part of the reform program of every individual country to believe that that's in the good interest, because that's exactly the battle that we had in the past when we spoke about reform. Should we protect our economies or should we put them to a higher level of competition? The challenge is still in our region, productivity and competitiveness. These are the two issues that we need to push forward. Regionalization of our trade will definitely put productivity and competitiveness under test. And the good news, it is happening at the political level. The bad news, business people are resisting it. Well, we have been hearing all morning, business talking about government, but yes, business people have been the lobbies behind slowing down or stopping regionalization. Yeah.
Is that right?
Yes.
Khalid?
Well, it's right and wrong. I think it's right. We're all protectionists from the business perspective. The same thing, governments are protectionists. But I'd like to thank Sheikh Ahmed for answering Arif Naqvi's point, his intervention in what I said. I think, yes, basic economic theory says profit maximization is what an entity is built for, but not profit maximization by shooting yourself in the foot. And Minister Salam, I think it's important when you say, let's not generalize that money has been pumped into banks by the governments. That's not been done. And the good thing, I'm not here to defend Bahrain, but I think the good thing about Bahrain, that did not happen. And that was good, it did not happen. The Bahrain, basically, they left it to the banks themselves. And I think the banks, in fairness, they survived the storm, but there is still a long way to go. That's my personal belief. A long way to go, because we still we have this argument between myself and a very important friend of mine that has the tsunami come to us or not yet? I believe we are in July 2008 in the Gulf. We yet to get to September 19th or 17th in the Gulf. But with hindsight that we are there, we should, as the private sector, we should be very careful and we would see what's been happening around us and deal with the risk management aspect. And similarly with the governments, I would like just to break it down to two things. The risks that I see coming out of what's going on around us. One risk is the issue of government interference, over government interference. And the governments, whether we like it or not, in the past 25 or 30 years, yes, reform has been coming through. I totally agree with Minister Rachid. Reform is very, very important. Matter of fact, it's been driven by the private sector. Rachid comes from the private sector. A lot of the people who are today in the cabinet in Egypt, they come from private sector. They started the competitiveness. It was the first ever competitiveness report, and it was very, very strong. I remember the first one, working with Rachid and Helmi and others in Egypt. So it has been driven, the reform, by the private sector. My worry is we're going to get back to the norms now where governments, we know better. We are in charge, we know better, and this tick thing, everybody enjoys investing. Everybody enjoys to be on Arif, Naqvi, or somebody else saying, okay, I'll take the box, invest here or don't invest there, including people sitting in government. So we need to be careful that the governments, this is a risk, that governments do not take the opportunity and take over once again. That's number one. Number two is transparency. Sheikh Ahmed talks about G20. Very important issue is transparency. I mean, Minister Rachid talks about the private sector being worried about things. Yes, of course they are worried, because governments and officials are not transparent. We have to be transparent. I'm not saying the rest of the world is transparent, but I don't care. I'm going to use Fadi Ghandour's sort of phrase here. I don't give a damn about the rest of the world. I care about this part of the world. Okay? I want to see transparency by governments, more transparency. And I want the governments to be more humble, to accept that they are not better than the private sector, that they know the thing better than the private sector. They do not know things better than the private sector. I mean, we deal with things day in, day out. We are there protecting our balance sheets. We're there protecting our shareholders. We're there protecting our investors. We're there protecting our depositors. So we basically should not be left alone, that we as central banks or as governments, as fiscal policy makers or monetary policy makers, we know what's better for you than you do. In that case, please come in and be in charge of the boards. You run the banks, you run the institutions, you run the companies. Do not say, okay, we tell you what to do, but you become accountable. I think accountability is an important thing. So my worry is that's a very, very high risk issue. Now, opportunities that I see from this. I think it's two ways, Rachid. I think opportunity is that the reform carries on. Education is basically the backbone of the reform. In the past 10 years, when we see the gap between rich and poor has substantially increased, we used to have what I would call the backbone of the economy, any economy, which was the middle class. Middle class has been eroded big, big time in the past 10 years. This is a cost you pay for capitalism. Thank you, Arif. Capitalism is there with us, whether we like it or not, and that's a cost that we paid. But now it's an opportunity that we learn from our lessons, and we create that middle class today. Middle class is the most important factor in the Middle East. It has to be recreated. We have an opportunity to do that. Actually, the biggest people who employ guys are small and medium-sized businesses. And that's what we got to basically push and push for. Push for from the private sector and push for from the public sector. So I see that as an opportunity that we basically push governments and push ourselves to be basically a driver of that. So this is an important thing. Number two that I see to be a very important factor from opportunity, I'm talking now from private sector perspective, that cross-border issues are there. We spoke about consolidation. Today, with a single currency in the Gulf, for argument's sake, what's going to happen with single currency in the Gulf? Tomorrow, you don't need Bahraini dinars. You don't need Kuwaiti dinars. You don't need, there's going to be one currency, whatever it's going to be called. And the big boys will take over the small boys. I don't need to have 16 or 17 or 18 commercial banks sitting in Bahrain or sitting in Dubai or sitting wherever. Okay? I can have 4 branches of the biggest bank in Saudi Arabia and will swarm me and will take me over. So it's something that creates opportunities that we create big banks. When I see that there are certain investors buying 10 or 15% of big banks in Europe or United States, you ask the question during this time of opportunities, why not? You create a large institution which takes over that bank totally, and you bring everything with you here. I mean, that mental blockage that we have in our part of the world, that guy knows better than us, and we use them as consultants or whatever, that the consultant is a white face, he knows better than I do. We should get out of that. And that actually stays with the governments and private sector. We have that mental blockage. We got to get out of that mental blockage. Since we have it, since we have the money with us, why not? We are the biggest bank in the world. Put all the Arab banks together. We are nothing in terms of size-wise. Why not become a strong enough, a big player in the world? I'm not talking about market cap. Rachid today's market cap is much, much higher than Citibank and others. I'm talking about real business. We could be big, and we should be big, and we should take now the opportunity to go forward and be big. I basically commend someone like Arif Naqvi. He's done extremely well, but he's done extremely well in a country where everybody was saying, they're going to drop, which is Dubai. Dubai created opportunities. Dubai has done extremely well. Dubai today, everybody is saying, we told Dubai they're going to go down. I'll tell you one thing. The day these crises go out, Dubai is the first country to benefit from that because they've developed their infrastructure to a point where everybody can go back to them and they will go back to them. So I think we need to be creative. We need to allow people to do things. We need to stop this idea of somebody is good, but he did not. Somebody had the idea and he did a good job. But hey, I have more power and I could not think like him. And now it's time for me to shoot him down. We should get out of that mentality. That mentality, unfortunately, stays with us today. That is an opportunity that we look forward. That is part of education. We got to educate the mindset of everybody, top and down. It's not just bringing people and saying, in the school, come up. We teach you this and that. Sorry, I have to teach myself. I have to teach the big guys. Change your mindset. So it's an opportunity to change the mindset.
Good. Do you want to jump in on this? Joe Saddi's got his hand. Go ahead first.
Yeah, I just want to say when I grow up, I want to be like Khalid-Janahi.
You've got 3 months to go.
Well, there is a very important point that Minister Rachid raised actually, which is around what he said, the reluctance of the private sector. I think, Minister, we have to stop and think for a second that it is actually the private sector which is the reason why we have regional WEF conferences. I think it is the private sector in the Arab world that has led the process of regionalization. It is the fact that the private sector became empowered in the last 10 years, and you were a part of that. It is the fact that the private sector became empowered and decided to cross border and went from being a local Omani company to being a company selling in Morocco that brought down trade barriers in the Arab world. So although, yes, governments have a very important role to play, I think the most important point of all is if there is anyone that is protectionist in the Arab world today, it is governments. Because the private sector is more than happy to extend across the borders and to start doing business across the region. The problem with protectionism in governments is the fact that every government at the end of the day, if we strip away all of the niceties, you care about Egypt. And Sheikh Ahmed cares about Bahrain, and then we start moving outwards and we start thinking about the region as a whole. The businessman in the Arab world actually, driven by that capitalistic motive, is willing to do business across borders. I think the reform process, as you mentioned it, the critical element of the reform process that has to be common is education, without question. And if the Arab world can reform its education processes and thinking, I think it'll take us 10 years, but we'll be in one of the most competitive environments that we can face.
Okay, we've got a lot of hands going up. I'm going to go first to Joe Saddi and then come back to Minister Rachid. Joe?
Sorry, I just wanted to add to what Khalid said on opportunities. You know, you mentioned, Khalid, the opportunity to build local, stronger and more global banks that, you know, in Middle Eastern hands. And I think there are the same opportunities available in other sectors as well. It's not only, you know, we've been talking about the financial sector, understandably, but I can think of...
I think I understand.
Absolutely. I think there are a number of sectors where we would encourage, you know, the strongest of the corporations around the block to think ambitiously. Now may be a good time for those companies who have the means to stake positions, you know, globally. I can think of sectors such as petrochemicals, oil and gas, manufacturing, and I know for a fact that a number of companies, in fact, are using precisely the crisis, in fact, to build capabilities, acquire stakes in companies outside, and emerge 3 or 4 years down the road much, much stronger than they are today. So again, the same point about, yes, we've got to deal with the current crisis, but we've also got to anticipate what will be the end game, you know, 3 to 5 years down the road, and that may be a golden opportunity for us in the region.
Good. We had Sheikh, Ahmed, and Rachid, and then I want to go to a couple other key questions. Sheikh Ahmed, you wanted to say something, and I'll go to Minister Rachid.
Yes, actually, we've been talking about many things, and Khalid brought up the issue of transparency, and I think we're trying to fix too many things at the same time. We have a financial crisis. We've got issues with the financial crisis. It's been developing over time from severe credit crunch to now we're looking at institutions that have got to deal with losses from different investments and so on. That's an issue that is important for us to address. And we address it as government from systemic risk potential. Once we're assured that there is no systemic risk, then we will deal with the individual issues as they come up in different institutions. Apart from that, I think the real issue for us is how to maintain growth, how to grow going forward out of this. That, to us, is the main challenge. Transparency is always an issue that's brought up. In our country, having to learn to live with democracy, we're always accused of not being transparent. I keep always saying, if we become more transparent than we are right now, we'll disappear. But the reality of the matter, democracy has taught us to communicate, it's taught us to have to go and convince the public opinion. And the public opinion is not only financial institutions, it's everybody out there. When we have to put money up to save the financial institutions, I've got to go make the case in our parliament, and it's going to be a very public affair. It's no longer something that you do in a closed office where somebody would walk in and say, well, I need so much money. Democracy has also taught us to win and lose sometimes and accept the opinion of the majority. So to me, we've got to focus on what is necessary to deal with the financial crisis, and we've got to focus on what are the issues that are the major drivers of growth in our own economies. There are many problems that we can deal with, but there are always many problems that we need to deal with.
Okay.
I'll stop here.
Thank you. Minister Rachid, then I've got a question for
Sure.
the panel.
Two points. First one to Arif, when he's defending business sector and mentioning that governments are the ones protectionism. Supporting protectionism. Well, this is not real life in the Middle East, Arif. I've seen it on both sides, and I can tell you this is not the way things happen. The reality of the matter today, our biggest challenge is the private sector. Yes, the private sector have been the one initiating such forums, they are sitting in such forums, they are discussing a lot of issues, but I can tell you, the real challenge we have today is that the private sector, in different countries, and I don't want to start naming countries, including mine, of course, don't want to let go privileges, don't want to let go certain advantage and competitive advantage that they have, and they don't want to let go some of the monopolies that they have. And this is on all sides, small, medium, large. There are some real companies, and that is really the turning point in our regional activity in the last 5-6 years, that there have been some real, genuine, regional companies that have started with a mindset that we would like to be regional. We don't want just to be a big Saudi company or a big Egyptian company or a big Emirati or Bahraini company. No, we would like to play a regional role. And these are the positive catalysts trying to push more and more for a regional integration and a regional trade and a regional investment forward. But against these few ones, there are hundreds and thousands of others who have already built certain vested interest and certain competitive position based on privileges. They will not let go easily. And that's private sector. That's not government only. I have hundreds of files on my desk, and I'm sure all my colleagues have the same situation in all the other countries, who are coming from companies asking for keeping their privileges, whether in protection, whether in certain ownership arrangements, whether in certain dealership arrangements, whether in the movement of people and movement of goods. And I'm saying this here because I expect the private sector to play a role in this. And I expect the leadership of some of these regional companies to continue to push for that. Second point that have been mentioned, reform is not only for rich people. We need to be careful. We have spoken about the fact that disparity and the income is increasing to certain segment of the population, but middle class is suffering. And in certain countries like mine, we have poverty. And for that purpose, we need to be aware, government of course first, but also business, that reform is not only in terms of liberalization, opening market, and just creating wealth to a number of people. And that's why the reform in Egypt have targeted very clearly in the last 2 years poverty elevation as well as social aspects, because without it we cannot continue the economic reform. And I'm saying it again because business have to understand that. We keep talking about the social responsibility of business. Well, social responsibility of business is also to be part of this reform programs that the governments are initiated. In Egypt, we have a number of programs, including tackling some of the poorest areas in Egypt. We have significant number of people in Egypt below poverty line. Well, we have to tackle that, and we need to tackle it, and we need to engage into a very serious and effective way to address this disparity of income, as well as the focus on certain geographical areas and certain segments of the population. That is part of the reform. Let's not forget it when we talk about the economic reform. If we don't succeed in that part, I think we will not be able to deliver to our community what we want.
Okay. I want to ask a quick question here about the lack of maturity of these economies, if I can put it that way. When we had oil prices at $100 a barrel in 2008, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, UAE, flourishing. Prices down at $50 a barrel. The Maghreb and Levant countries doing much better. Collapse in the Gulf economy. That means that we don't have a cross-border investment. It means that we're not that mature with our monetary tools, and that the Gulf is far too dependent on oil because it hasn't diversified. Who wants to tackle it?
Yes, I think that's a very important issue, and we're facing that in our part of the world. But I want to go back to what Arif said, and I tend to agree with him when he said that governments are against protectionism, and that it's not the private sector per se. And this is part of what we're seeing over the last year, and especially when it comes to oil, $100 and down to 50. I think, and in my ex-post as a Minister of Labor, I think the Minister of Interior was more effective than the Minister of Labor when it comes to labor mobility. And the decisions were there in terms of giving work permits or what have you for Jordanians working in the Gulf states, or Egyptians working in Jordan, or what have you. And I think, again, when we talk about protectionism, goods and products that were not protected on a tariff-based customs did extremely well in our country, while those that were protected, their growth over the last 5 years went down by 10 to 15%. And other items like the pharmaceuticals, which is zero protection, went up by 183% in less than 5 years. So I think the private sector tend to lobby against protectionism in certain industries, but I think the final decision is with governments. And I think they're the ultimate decision makers that can get their way through, either through parliaments, through the cabinet, or what have you, to get things. And I think this is what makes the regional investments, the regional flow of investments. I think when you have such issues out of the agendas of governments.
Good, but can we go back to this question about oil almost as big brother? Because it's very easy when you have this wealth in the ground to flourish when the prices are high, and then deflate when prices just collapse. Khalid first, and then Arif.
No. Well, he's younger, so he can start.
Okay.
Well, I took issue with the word you used, which is that, while countries in the greater region and in the Maghreb, etc., were okay with that price, the Gulf countries were collapsing. I mean, look, I live there, I see it, we all experience business. There has been no collapse, John. I think it is very important to work through that. The Gulf countries are not facing crisis. I think that, yes, there has been a jolt, there has been a slowdown, there has been a realignment of thinking, but at no point have I seen or experienced anything approaching a collapse. Now, the important thing to recognize is that we spent so many years talking ourselves away from the reliance on oil, saying that we were a regional economy that had infrastructure capability, X, Y, Z, you name it. But when push comes to shove, the reality is that this region is very dependent on oil. If you look at the GCC alone, 62% of the world's oil reserves sit under the GCC. And yet it only produces 31% of global annual production. So if you look at that mismatch, and it doesn't matter when you think oil will eventually run out or start becoming a scarce resource, the GCC's share of that is going to keep growing higher and higher. And therefore, whatever consequential impact on the price that is going to have, I think the beneficiaries of that will be the GCC. But having said that, the integration that this region should experience, and I think that Minister Rachid has alluded to time and again, I think that the whole concept around inclusion and the whole concept around regionalization, the reason why I get a little bit emotional about the issue on protectionism is because the enabling environment can only be created by government. And it is that enabling environment that government needs to create, because we keep hearing about social responsibility and how, companies that are more transparent and are more focused on governance are better companies. Well, we're all aspiring to get there and we all try our best. But if that process can be led from the top, and that governance process can be brought in, more privatization, more reform on the agenda, more focus on education, I think we as a region, individually as countries and then collectively, are going to begin to become less reliant on big brother oil.
Joe?
Just a quick remark, John, to say that the real question regarding oil at this time is, what do you do with the oil surpluses that have been accumulated? It's not really whether we should have oil or not. We have it. Let's use it the best way we can. And there are some reasons to be hopeful. I mean, if you look at the recently announced Saudi budget, which has maintained, in fact, the course on expenditures, and if you peel the onion sort of and look at that spending, well, they've kept funding, for instance, some very critical modernization programs around justice reform, around education, we're talking about it, and so on. Much more needs to be done. But again, the real question is putting it to good use and staying the course on what is needed for the long term, as opposed to using it to plug some holes and, seal the borders and erect walls, and everybody will be fine. So.
Well, that brings me to another point I think is essential, is what we've seen the sovereign wealth funds do over the last 12 to 18 months. I can list probably 40 big brand names in the West that looked very attractive to the sovereign funds, and they took stakes of anywhere between 5 and 10%, and are, like most investors around the world right now, kind of crying in their beer, if I can say it that way. Shouldn't this wealth be recirculated into the region in a much more aggressive way?
Everybody makes mistakes. Just forget about it and move on.
Well,
not on the scale that we're talking about, but...
just the point about protectionism.
Well, let's go back to the sovereign funds
but
first.
I'll come to both, because I think protection is important. Yes, Minister Rachid talks about the protection, actually the private sector is involved. He's right to an extent. Yes, I agree with you, Arif. The enabler is the government. But reform, unfortunately with reform, whether we like it or not, we're getting more and more of the elites in the business sector getting involved on the way you are set. Even in the enabling, it's basically they are getting involved. So there is that issue of basically you play one against the other. You want to reform on one side, where it means everybody comes on board and talks.
He's right, because it's a much bigger issue than you and I are dealing with. He is right, because when he talks about hundreds of files...
No, he's right, because he's going to give you a business and he's going to give me a business. But that's the main reason he's right.
Sadly,
but
I haven't seen it yet. So.
No, but I think he's right in that aspect. Let's come back to the sovereign wealth funds. Now, this is the sticking point which I was mentioning earlier on. Why not make your own large bank? I'm sorry, I'm going to talk about financial institutions here. But when we look at about the amount of money which was invested in Citibank, which invested in Merrill Lynch and whatever, that was only, few months before the crisis. Whilst we had one large bank, okay, I can see somebody, that's why I remember, Gulf Bank in Kuwait. Gulf Bank in Kuwait needed $1 billion dinar or whatever just to basically safeguard. Whilst we had $5 billion put in Merrill Lynch just a few months before that without even thinking about it. I'm sorry, we did our risk management, the price was perfect then, and we put our money there. I think sovereign wealth funds, whether we like it or not, if we define sovereign wealth funds to be the funds of the country, the reserves of the country, I think before you take it out, for God's sake, develop your own damn place. We are, whether we like it or not, I get fed up with this issue of saying real estate problems in the region, real estate problems have been pushed up. I hate this coming from policymakers and from the private sector, because we are not United States. We love to be the US. We love to be the US. Everybody wants to be the US. So there's a problem in the US on real estate. We have a real estate problem. Unfortunately, US is a developed country. US, they've got their matured market. Most of what's happening, they have infrastructure fully built in. Most of it is built in. We have a long, long way to go from Morocco to Bahrain, a long, long way to go to develop our infrastructure. I come back. Maybe the only semi-developed country is Dubai. That's maybe the semi-developed country. That's why where they were hit on real estate, maybe it's much more factual than the other countries. So really to concentrate on real estate is the wrong thing. I mean, I can see it from different institutions. We were very happy to allow banks to invest in SIVs, to allow banks to invest in CDOs, simply because they are rated. There are these big highlights, big banks have been put in. So central banks and regulators, and they were happy that you do that. But do not put money in real estate. Do not put money in infrastructure with real estate related. I think our mentality is totally wrong. We got to bring our money to develop our own place. Then we start going out. I think that is another, sorry that now you brought it, that's another bloody high risk that I'm worried about because of this crisis, that we're going to basically take this as an opportunity. Because when you are in power, the more you're outside, the more covers you. That's the way I look at it. So then you have that thing to kind of play with the powery, let's put it that way, okay? So we need to get out of that mental blockage and bring the money back. We need to believe in our own people. We need to believe in our own societies. We need to believe in our own economies. It cannot be that the Arif Naqvis and Khalid Janahis of this world only do it. It's got to be everybody else working together and put the money back in. So I am totally, I mean, yes, we're talking with hindsight that everything went wrong. I mean, somebody from one of these big sovereign wealth funds would say, look, if Citibank shares would have gone up to $60 or $70, we did the right thing. Even that was wrong, because it was not with you. You're not developing your own damn place. You're developing somewhere else. Citibank will employ the best people. Citibank will get the right brains. Citibank will do the innovations. Why don't you do that in your own place? Why do you have to do it outside? We have this mental blockage that the other guy knows better than we do. We should get out of that. We should basically, maybe he does. Why don't we get to that position? Why don't we push ourselves, push our people, invest in people to get there? I think that is something which I don't hear anywhere anybody saying. But in something that Sheikh Ahmed said, and I think it's important, the transparency issue. And Joe brought it out from basically from the reserves that we have, the excess reserve. Sheikh Ahmed is the Minister of Finance in Bahrain. He is basically, every week he has to go and sit in front of these 40, is it 40, Sheikh Ahmed? 40 parliamentarians. He has to answer on the budget. The budget was approved when? Last week?
It's been a while.
A while, okay. But it was 4 months behind schedule. They could not do anything because for 4 months, because anything he wants to do, he has to have it be approved by, should have been approved as part of the budget. So we're sitting there, even the parliamentarians, I'm talking about democracy now, we basically shoot ourselves in the foot. I mean, rather than allowing the business to go forward. Yes, Bahrain, I think it was based on $70 a barrel, which means there is a deficit is going to come through. Well, that is good because they're saying, okay, this is our program, this is our, we're going to be investing, we're not going below that. I think Minister Salam said that too, because we're saying, okay, we're going to increase our deficit, we're going to go forward. The question which gets back, which is a simple question, fine, you had these excess reserves before, where is it? Why do you have to borrow money? It comes back, so it's not an easy exercise, but it's a good exercise. I know it doesn't make life easy for the people sitting on the fiscal side, but it's a good thing. So I think the sovereign wealth funds, John, if they are sovereign wealth funds, not private wealth funds, which I call them private wealth funds, then they should be reinvested in the place and develop the countries.
Okay. We have 10 minutes. I wanted to open the floor to questions, but let me just flag that. I'm going to come to Minister Rachid. If we can have one microphone here in the front row and then one in the third row. Microphones, please. Yeah. Minister Rachid, do you want to comment, and then I'm going to go to the floor.
A quick one on the sovereign wealth funds. I think we need to work very hard on the other side of the equation, which is really the project side. And here I would like just to mention the importance of the infrastructure, because let us all remember that it was only very few years back, 2-3 years back probably, that only governments were investing in infrastructure. Only recently that in some of the countries now that we are seeing progress in the direction that we are opening up the infrastructure for private investment, where it will allow more commercial, profit-oriented really investment to take place. This is where we really need to have a focus, also working on a regional level, because most of the mega infrastructure projects are regional ones. So we need really to continue to push the boundaries here in infrastructure, opening that sector to private sector, moving more and more into regional infrastructure projects. This is where the wealth funds can really play a very significant role in the future. Yeah.
Good, thanks. We have only 10 minutes. I want to take 3 quick questions. I ask you to be brief if you can, and just direct it to one person on the panel. Thanks.
One only. All right, I'll be very briefly. I've heard the debate between the government and the private sector. I strongly believe from a private sector is that the investors, the private sector, have to do their job and the government to do their job. As the government, we don't see any enabling environment. I'm very much in favor of Mr. Arif's comment. The government has to build an enabling environment in place. For example, SME. Name for me one Arabic government that have a specialized policies for SMEs. SMEs has been neglected. Give me one country that has specialized policies for SMEs effectively in place. As for investment, all the Arabic investment so far has not been diversified. I think, Mr. Arif, you're invested heavily in GEM education. So what I want to say is that the investment funds has to be effectively investing in the education and go to the education sector and play also a playing role in changing the policy in the education sector. We have seen this in Qatar. Qatar Foundation has been investment from Qatar government, but effective investment. What I mean by effective investment, not just put the money in a company and run away. In the last 10 years, since 2000, to be honest with you, the Arab world has been divided. America searching for Bin Laden, and the Arab media investment searching for the superstar in the Arabic countries. We can't see a real investment in the education, whether in media and so on and so forth. All the investment has been put in corporates, in banks, real estate, and as Mr. Janahi said, 5 billion in Merry Lunch. So what I'm trying to say, if we have a enabling environment plus diversified investment from both parties, our Arab world will be much better than any other world in the globe.
Good. We use it as a comment, but thanks for that on the SME focus. Sir?
Well, I can answer a lot about the SMEs and what the government of Bahrain can do about the SMEs, but I think let's stay out of it. I think I have not a question, but a comments about what Khalid said. Khalid said that he wants the banks to invest in real estate, and he thinks that the banks wants to be given the limits to...
I didn't say that, but I'll answer.
Well, you said that you should not be interfered in the real estate, the government, and I cannot see that there is any value of investing in real estate where there's no creation of jobs, and how that can actually create jobs and lower the or increase the middle class, as you said. What we would like the private sector to be involved more in creating jobs and getting the private sector to employ more people, and as you said, to participate in expanding the middle class. So rather than investing in buildings and renting these buildings and selling it to outside people, that will not create jobs. What we'd like the private sector is to create jobs, participate, put their money in small and medium industries. Thank you.
Can I just say, sure. I think with 70% of this region, which is made up of small and medium enterprises, I genuinely believe you've hit the nail on the head. I think that is where the answer lies, not in big business. But I also think that's part of the problem that Minister Rachid was talking about, which is that is where also the major issues are. That's my own view.
I think, Nazar, I think you got it wrong. What I said, you see, this is the point that I'm saying. Real estate here I'm talking about, part of your infrastructure development, whether you like it or not. Take Bahrain. You have a problem of a housing problem in Bahrain. That for me is an infrastructural issue. You need to develop that. Who's going to develop it? You want to develop yourself, or you want to allow the private sector, since you are iqtisad hur, as we say? You're going to allow the private sector, or you want to do it yourself? So that is part of infrastructure. You need to develop a lot of things in Bahrain and elsewhere. Yes, there is big buildings. Let me use Bahrain as a good reason. But the most of the business, which is the big buildings coming in Bahrain, is not done by the Bahrainis. This is the cross-border investment by the Saudis, by the Kuwaitis, elsewhere, because they see an opportunity. It comes back to the first point Arif made. They see an opportunity to make money. They went there and they made money. When you talk about, really, what I'm worried about is the banks, okay, getting in. I would like to be involved in infrastructure. I want to be involved in infrastructure, in the full field of infrastructure, not just doing power plants, not just doing roads, even the housing, which is part of the infrastructure. I want to be involved in that. That is what I'm talking about. The worry is that once you do that, when I give you or any individual money to go and build a house, because you don't have a house. Of course there is a gap. I know there is a gap. There is a gap, but do not look at the big buildings. Most of the big buildings we have in Bahrain, with all due respect, is done by outsiders. They come in because they want to make money. Most of the people who invest in and invest out, the last user is an outsider. This is good for Bahrain. You should look at it from the positive side or the negative side. But does that create jobs for Bahrainis? I will agree with you. It does not create jobs for Bahrainis. But why should somebody coming from Saudi Arabia or Egypt investing in Bahrain think about creating jobs for Bahrainis? Sorry, I'm talking about now, at this stage. For me, no. For me, I will think. But I'm going to be, I want the room and the door available for me to do these things. The rules, the way we're going with our rules, is we're saying, no, you should stop doing this. There is a limitation of this. Because we are putting everything and bundling it under one umbrella. That's the problem that we're having. We should basically saying, okay, you cannot do this, you can't do this. If it's part of infrastructure, and this is part of, as I said, the mindset, is part of your infrastructure, doing housing or not. If it's not, I take my hands off, say, fine, it's not part of infrastructure. A lot of people in Bahrain, they don't have houses. You have issues in the housing. Here's the minister sitting, and he has the budget, and he knows he has a problem every year, how much he puts into that. So why not the private sector get involved and do that? And they should be doing that. And
Okay,
the best one is the banking.
Good. Sorry about that. I just want to take one final question. The gentleman had his hand up early. If I could just have you to keep it brief.
Hi, my name is Pierre. I'm part of the youth delegation. I will address my question to Mr. Saddi, but I would like every business leader in this room to consider it as well. You mentioned a mismatch between universities' curriculums and private sector needs. We as youth are aware of this gap ever since we were school students. It is very frustrating to be in a class knowing that most, if not all, of what you are learning is being useless and not up to date. As a business leader, not as a CEO of your company, how do you think you can address this issue, and what are the future plans? Because this subject has been in discussion for a long period and nothing has been done yet. Thank you.
Actually, can we all clap in response to that question? A great question.
Again, as I think it's a very important topic, as I think we've all stressed in this panel. Again, if you think about whose responsibility it is a shared responsibility. I mean, governments have to think their part in terms of, revamping the curriculums, retraining the teachers, incentivizing the teacher, incentivizing the students. So create what someone called the enabling environment. The second part of it is companies have also a duty to play their part in it. For instance, let me give you the example of our company. We hire young people who have little experience, train them, and then send them abroad for higher education with a view to hire them back if that's what they want to do. So I think it's there is a big role for government to play, frankly, in the education sector. There is also the private sector who has to work hand in hand with government. One issue that I'd like to add on this is, often people will answer, we're throwing a lot of money at education, we're throwing a lot of money at training, for instance. But the point about it, that money would be so much better invested if the private sector had a role in defining with the public sector what kind of training is really needed. That money would be so much better invested if there was some follow-up on monitoring on results of that training and what kind of return of investment are we getting on the billions we're spending on training programs and what have you. So there's an effectiveness part of it. It's a very complex issue and it has to be done, but I think it's going to be, it's a work for multiple generations, frankly, to get to where we need to.
Okay, we had the one girl who had their hand up, the lady. Just very brief if you can, then we do need to conclude.
Okay, I just have a question to all of you. My name is Sheikh and I come from the Gulf.
You can hold the microphone a little bit closer. There you go.
Okay. Do you believe that the agencyfication factor is significant to the reform and security of the Arab economies, like having a mutual incentive where we're not fighting each other, but we're working all together? Comment, please.
Okay, what was the first part of it? I missed it.
Do you believe that the agencyfication factor or outsourcing the government to the private sector is important to help reform the economies?
I see a lot of people shaking their head. Arif, you want to tackle it and then move around?
No.
That's pretty pathetic. Sheikh Ahmed will do better than that.
I can try and answer. I think in the Gulf these days, we can say we're in a competitive environment. The different states within the Gulf is actually moving on reform, sometimes at the same pace, sometimes in different sectors at a different pace. The talk, for example, about SMEs, we have excellent infrastructure for SMEs. Education, we can see competition in education, but there are different ways that we've tackled the issue of education reform in different states within the GCC, for example. But overall, I see this competitive nature between the different GCC states as something that is very positive. We're competing on who can deliver more on different reform programs. So if we're talking about coordinating and trying to introduce systems where people can work across different states, we are trying that through the GCC Secretariat and the work we do in the GCC. People see it as slow. We see it as it needs to take its time to make sure that we build consensus within the different GCC states. But what I feel is happening when you look at capital markets, for example, I started working in the stock exchange, and at the time we were all different stock exchanges in different countries. Today, when you look at GCC markets, you see all of them together, and you can cross-list, and you can see markets operating together. And there's when there are new issues, they're actually in more than one country, and you can subscribe in more than one country to those issues. So I see us moving much closer together. It's happened more in financial markets than other sectors, but I think through the different private sector organizations we've been working, we see them working throughout the Gulf in a much more coordinated way. We focused, I think, this panel a lot more on banks and financial institutions, but I think there is good growth to be seen in other sectors in our economies, whether it's logistics, telecom, infrastructure. I think all those sectors are important to our economies.
Good. Thank you for fielding the question, since the gentleman to the left, the fine gentleman, decided to punt on it. Misters, I thank you for taking all the questions. Gentlemen, from the business community and the healthy debate between the two, and the questions particularly coming from the youth, we do appreciate. Nice round of applause for our panel, and we'll see you next time.